My father told me the day I got my acceptance letter to medical school that I should think carefully about whether I really wanted to do this to myself. He didn't mean the hours. He didn't mean the dowers. He didn't mean the debt. He meant something else entirely, and we both knew it. Surgery is hard, Nora, he said, setting the letter back on the kitchen counter without looking at me. It's not a field that's forgiving. You've always been sensitive. My brother was 22 then and hadn't finished his bachelor's degree yet. My father never once told him to think carefully about anything. I folded the letter back into the envelope and put it in my bag and said I was going for a walk. I walked 4 miles in the wrong shoes and came back with blisters and a decision. I was going. I was going no matter what. And I was never going to ask my father if that was okay. That was 11 years ago. I need you to understand something about my family before any of the rest of this makes sense. We are, on the surface, a perfectly normal American family from outside of Columbus, Ohio. My father spent 30 years as a hospital administrator. My mother taught second grade until her knees gave out. My brother is 18 months older than me and has, for as long as I can remember, been the son that everything else orbited around. His name is Brett. He's charming and broad-shouldered, and he laughs at the right moments, and he remembers people's names. He is the kind of man who makes a good first impression everywhere he goes, and if you don't look too closely at the second impression, you can convince yourself the first one was the real one. I spent most of my childhood in his shadow without fully understanding that was where I was. I thought I was just quieter. I thought I was just more serious. I thought the fact that my father lit up when Brett walked into a room and went neutral when I did was just a personality thing, a preference thing, something that didn't mean anything about my worth. It took me a long time to understand that it meant everything. I became a cardiothoracic surgeon. I want to say that plainly without apology because I spent too many years softening it in conversation, adding qualifiers, watching people's faces to make sure I wasn't making anyone uncomfortable by being too much. I am a cardiothoracic surgeon. I trained at Ohio State, then did my residency at Cleveland Clinic, then my fellowship at UCSF. I came home to Columbus 3 years ago to take a position at Mercy General, which is one of the top cardiac programs in the state. My father works in hospital administration 2 buildings away. I did not fully think that through when I accepted the offer, but the salary was exceptional and my mother had been asking me to come home for years, and I told myself it would be fine. We were adults. We were professionals. Whatever our dynamic had been when I was 18 and still needing his approval, we were past that now. We were not past that. Brett moved back to Columbus about 18 months before any of this happened. He'd been in Chicago working in pharmaceutical sales, which had suited him perfectly. He was excellent at taking people to expensive dinners and making them feel like the most interesting person in the room. He was less excellent at the parts of the job that required follow-through and discipline, and eventually, those parts caught up with him, and he came home. My father bought him a condo in Clintonville. He helped him get a consulting contract with Mercy General's administration division. He introduced him around at every golf outing and charity dinner until Brett had a whole new network built on borrowed credibility. I didn't say anything. It wasn't my business. Brett was my brother and he needed help and my father gave it freely. And I told myself that was fine. That was what families did. And the thing sitting in my chest that felt like resentment was something I should probably work through in therapy. I was in therapy. My therapist, a calm woman named Dr. Okafor, who never lost her composure no matter what I told her, had been gently pointing out for 2 years that I had a pattern of minimizing legitimate grievances. She called it preemptive forgiveness. I called it survival. The thing that changed everything started on a Thursday in March. I had been working for about 6 months on a protocol for post-operative care in high-risk cardiac patients, specifically a modified monitoring approach for patients over 70 with comorbid conditions that dramatically reduced readmission rates. This was not a small thing. Readmission in cardiac surgery is expensive, it's dangerous for patients, and it is one of the primary metrics hospitals use to evaluate departmental performance. My data was preliminary, but it was clean, and my department chief, Dr. Parments Harrington, had encouraged me to prepare a formal presentation for the hospital's quarterly quality improvement board. The board included senior administration, department heads, the CMO, and the CFO. It was not glamorous, but it was the kind of thing that mattered, the kind of thing that got noticed. I spent 3 months preparing that presentation. I came in early and stayed late, and I restructured the data 4 different ways until it was airtight. I practiced the delivery in my bathroom mirror at 11 o'clock at night. I emailed a draft to Dr. Thierry Harrington and incorporated every note he gave me. I was ready. 2 weeks before the presentation, Brett called me. He called on a Sunday, which was unusual. We had a relationship that existed mostly of family dinners and occasional texts. He was warm when we talked in a way that always felt slightly performative, like he was playing the role of good brother and wanted credit for how well he was doing it. "Hey," he said, "Dad mentioned you have something big coming up." A presentation to the board? I should have felt something then. A warning. Some small animal instinct that knew what was coming. But I was tired and he was my brother and I just said yes. That was right. I was presenting in 2 weeks. "That's amazing," he said. "Can I see what you've got? I've been doing some consulting work with administration, and I actually know a few of the people on that board really well. I might be able to give you some tips on how to pitch to them specifically." What they respond to? I hesitated. But it seemed reasonable. It seemed like a brotherly thing. And I think some part of me, the part that had been hoping my entire life that he would see me as a peer, as someone worth respecting, wanted to believe he was offering this in good faith. I sent him the full deck, every slide, the data, the methodology, the projected cost savings, the implementation timeline, everything. I sent it on a Sunday evening. By Tuesday, my father had called Dr. Harrington's office to schedule a meeting. I didn't find out about that meeting until afterward, when one of the administrative coordinators, a woman named Phyllis, who had worked at Mercy General for 22 years and had no patience for politics, mentioned it to me in the break room. "Your dad came in to talk to Harrington on Tuesday," she said, refilling her coffee. "With your brother. I thought you knew." I did not know. I went home that night and sat at my kitchen table for a long time without turning on the lights. Then I called Brett. He answered on the second ring, cheerful, like a man with a clear conscience. "What were you and Dad doing in Harrington's office?" I asked. A half-second pause. "We just thought it would help to give some context. Dad knows Harrington from way back. We thought if he understood the administrative angle better, you'd have a smoother presentation." Brett. "You took my presentation to my boss without telling me." "We didn't take anything. We just had a conversation. Nora, come on. We're trying to help you." "What did you tell him?" Another pause. This one longer. "We just framed it a little differently, positioned it as something the administration has been interested in developing. It reads better that way, like it's a collaborative initiative rather than one person's project." I understood then. I understood exactly what had happened. He hadn't helped me. He had introduced the idea to Harrington as something he and my father had been working on with administrative input. He had taken the front door off my presentation and walked in through it and rearranged all the furniture and was now telling me he'd done me a favor. "That is my work," I said. "My data. My protocol. My 3 months." "Nobody's saying it isn't," he said, and his voice had shifted into something I recognized, the slightly aggrieved tone he used when he felt accused of something he believed he'd gotten away with cleanly. "But the way you had it framed, it was too clinical, too narrow. We helped you make it bigger." I hung up. I sat in my dark kitchen and I did not call anyone and I did not cry and I did not make any decisions. I just sat there and breathed and let the full shape of it settle over me. Then I thought about what Dr. Okafor would ask me. She would ask what I actually wanted. Not what I thought I should want. Not what would keep the peace. Not what would make my father proud. What did I actually want? I wanted my work to be mine. I wanted to walk into that boardroom and own every word of that presentation. And I wanted whoever had done this to understand that they had miscalculated badly. I went to bed. I slept 6 hours. I woke up and I made a plan. The first thing I did was call Dr. Harrington myself, first thing Monday morning, and asked for 20 minutes of his time that afternoon. He said yes. I walked into his office and I was calm. I had the original version of my deck on my laptop, and I had my data logs with timestamps, and I had 3 months of email documentation, and I set them on his desk in a neat stack, and I said, "I need to be direct with you about something." He was a careful man, Harrington. Measured. He had been doing this for 30 years, and he had seen most things. He looked at the stack of documents, and then he looked at me, and he said, "Go ahead." I told him exactly what had happened. Not emotionally. Not with accusations that I couldn't prove, just the sequence of events. Here is when I began this work. Here is the documentation of that. Here is the presentation I sent my brother. Here is the date I sent it. Here's what apparently happened after. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The presentation to the board is still yours." I nodded. "I know, I'm not asking you to intervene. I'm asking you to know the history of this project before I walk in there, so that if anyone tries to reframe who owns this work, you have the full context." He looked at me steadily. "I appreciate that, Dr. Callahan." He had never called me that before. He usually just said Nora. I thanked him and I left. I did not look at my phone for the rest of the day, because I knew my father had probably already called Brett, and Brett had probably already started his version of events, and I did not want any of it near me yet. I needed to be clean for the next 2 weeks. I practiced my presentation every night. I knew it word for word. I knew every data point. I knew every question the board might ask, and I had the answer ready before they finished asking it. I was not going to be diminished in that room. Not by my brother, not by my father's 40 years of connections, not by the version of the story that had been quietly circulating in the administrative wing. I was going to walk in there and be so completely and undeniably the author of that work that there would be no room for any other story. The morning of the board presentation, my father texted me. It said, "Good luck today. Brett mentioned he might stop by. He's been very invested in this project." I read it twice. Then I put my phone face down on my bathroom counter and finished getting dressed. The boardroom was on the 4th floor, a glass-walled room that looked out over the hospital's east courtyard. There were 12 people seated when I walked in. Department heads, the CFO, the CMO, 2 external quality consultants, and seated at the far end of the table, my father, because he was senior enough in administration that he was sometimes included in these meetings. Brett was standing near the window. He was wearing a suit I hadn't seen before. Charcoal gray, clearly new. He smiled when he saw me. The smile of a man who believed he was about to watch something go the way he'd arranged for it to go. I smiled back. I set my laptop at the presenter's position. I pulled up my deck. Dr. Harrington sat directly to the left of the board chair. A woman named Dr. Sandra Voss, who was one of the most respected figures in Midwest hospital administration and who I had never formally met. She had silver hair and very straight posture, and she was looking at me with the particular attention of someone who has been briefed. I understood in that moment that Harrington had said something. I didn't know what. I didn't need to know what. I didn't need to know what. I just needed to do what I had prepared to do. I presented for 38 minutes. I did not stumble. I did not qualify. I did not apologize for taking up space or for the clarity of my conclusions. I walked them through the methodology, the patient cohort, the outcomes data, the cost analysis, a projected reduction in readmission expenditure of approximately $2.3 million annually across our cardiac program, and I answered every question with the precision of someone who had built this from the ground up, because I had built it from the ground up. About 20 minutes in, I noticed Brett had sat down. He was watching me with an expression I had never seen on him before, not his usual easy confidence. Something more careful, more recalculating. My father was not looking at me. He was looking at the table. At the end, Dr. Tom Voss asked me one question. She said, "Dr. Callahan, walk me through the genesis of this protocol. I want to understand how you came to identify this specific patient population." I held her gaze. About 8 months ago, I had a patient, 74, triple bypass, 2 prior cardiac events, type 2 diabetes. By every standard metric, she was high-risk post-op but stable enough to follow our usual monitoring protocol. I didn't feel right about it. I ordered extended telemetry. On day 3, we caught an arrhythmia that would have been fatal. She went home 12 days later. I started pulling data on similar patients that same week. The room was quiet. Dr. Voss nodded slowly. "And the research design, the data collection process, entirely mine," I said. "I can provide full documentation, timestamps, data logs, drafts with version history, everything." She nodded again. Then she looked at Harrington just briefly, and something passed between them that I was not party to, but could read clearly enough. "Thank you, Dr. Callahan," she said. "This is impressive work." The board adopted the protocol, not in committee, not pending further review. They voted to adopt it, pending a 6-month pilot in our cardiac ICU at the end of that same meeting. Dr. Cures, Boss said they wanted to move quickly because the data was clean and the stakes were real. I walked out of that boardroom and I stood in the hallway and I breathed for a moment. My father came out a few minutes later. He looked older than he had going in, somehow. He stopped when he saw me and he opened his mouth and then he closed it again. I waited. "Nora," he said finally. "Dad, he stopped again. "You did good work." It was the most inadequate thing he could have said, and we both knew it. It was years of silence compressed into 4 words that still couldn't quite reach me. "I know," I said. I didn't hug him. I didn't fill the silence with the reassurance he was waiting for. I just nodded and I went back to my floor. Because I had a patient at 2 o'clock and I was a cardiothoracic surgeon, and that was the real thing, that had always been the real thing, and I was done waiting for him to see it. Brett found me at my locker at the end of the day. He leaned against the neighboring locker the way he had leaned against things his whole life, loose and casual, like he was at home everywhere. "You were good in there," he said. "I know." "Nora." "Brett." I turned to look at him. "I'm not angry. I want you to know that because I think you're waiting for me to be angry and I'm not, I'm something else. I'm done. I don't want to fight about this, and I don't want to explain to you what you did, and I don't want to hear your version of why it was actually helpful. I'm just done." He looked at me for a long moment. Something moved across his face that might have been shame, if it got the chance to fully form. "Okay," he said quietly. I closed my locker. I picked up my bag. 3 weeks later, Dr. Mylacker, boss, called me directly to ask if I would lead the pilot program committee. She also mentioned, in the same conversation, that the board had some concerns about the consulting arrangement with one of the administrative contractors. She didn't say Breck's name, but she didn't need to, and that they were reviewing whether the scope of that contract was appropriate. I said I was glad to hear it. I said I looked forward to the work. I hung up and I sat at my desk in my office that I had earned, and I thought about that patient. 74 years old, named Margaret, who had sent me a Christmas card every year since. Who was alive because I had trusted my instincts over the standard protocol. That was the point. That had always been the point. Not my father's approval. Not Brett's borrowed credibility. Not any of the politics in that building that had tried to swallow me quietly from 2 buildings away. Just the work. Just the patience. Just the thing I had known I was meant to do since I was 12 years old, standing in a hospital waiting room, watching a doctor walk out and tell a family that their mother was going to be okay. My father called that evening. I let it go to voicemail. I'd call him back. I wasn't cruel and I wasn't cutting him off. He was my father and my mother loved him. And we would figure out some version of a relationship that was honest. But I was going to do it on my own time, from my own ground. Without the old habit of shrinking myself down to fit into the space he'd decided I was allowed to occupy. I made dinner. I opened a good bottle of wine. I sat at my kitchen table on the white this time and I thought about the pilot program, about the 12 patients we'd enroll in the first cohort, about the variables I still needed to control for. I was exactly where I was supposed to be. I had put myself there. That was the part no one could touch. I thought a lot about what actually happened in that boardroom. Not the professional part. I've made peace with that. I mean the human part. The part where my father couldn't look at me while I spoke. The part where Brett sat down halfway through my presentation and something shifted in his face that I'd never seen before. Here's what I've come to understand. People like Brett don't take things from you because they're evil. They do it because they've never had to build anything themselves. My father made it too easy. Every door opened before Brett had to figure out how to knock. And when you've never had to earn something from nothing, you start to believe that attaching your name to someone else's work is just called networking. You tell yourself it's strategy. You sleep fine. I used to resent that. I used to lie awake cataloging the specific ways it was unfair. But resentment is just energy with nowhere to go. And I had better things to do with mine. What I know is this. The work protected me. Not luck. Not Dr. Harrington stepping in. Not Dr. Boss's sharp eyes. Not any single person deciding to be decent. The work itself. 3 months of it, documented, time-stamped, built on a real patient named Margaret, who sent me a Christmas card every year. That was what nobody could touch. Brett could put his name on a PowerPoint. He could not put his name on the data. He could not explain the methodology. He could not tell you why I ordered extended telemetry on a Tuesday night when the standard protocol said she was stable. He didn't know because he hadn't been there. You can't steal the hours. You can't steal the thinking. That's the thing about integrity. And I don't mean integrity in the motivational poster sense. I mean the structural kind. The kind where what you do when nobody's watching matches what you claim when everyone is. Brett had a gap there, and that gap was always going to show under pressure. It just needed the right room and the right questions. I keep thinking about what Dr. Okafor called preemptive forgiveness. The habit of excusing people before they've even finished wronging you. I did that my whole life with my father and my brother. I minimized, I contextualized. I told myself the resentment was my problem to fix. And in some ways, that habit cost me. I handed Brett my entire presentation because some quiet part of me still wanted him to see me as worth respecting, and I let that want override what I actually knew about who he was. But here's the other side of it. That same quality, that same instinct to stay quiet and keep building instead of fighting every slight, is what made the work unassailable by the time it needed to be. I didn't spend my energy on arguments I couldn't win. I spent it on research I could prove. My father said I did good work, standing in that hallway looking like a man who had just understood something 20 years too late. It was the smallest thing he could have said, but I didn't need it to be bigger anymore. That was the real change. Not what happened in the boardroom, but the fact that his approval had simply stopped being the unit of measurement I used for myself. I don't know exactly when that happened. Somewhere between the blisters from that 4-mile walk at 18 and the moment I ordered telemetry on a hunch and saved a woman's life. The work. Always the work. That was where I actually lived.